Good evening. My name is Katie Chaka Parks, and I'm the manager of adult education at the Zuckelman Holocaust Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Black Heroines of World War II. I want to thank our program sponsors, the PNC Foundation, and our program supporters, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Joan Chernoff Epstein and Robert Epstein, Rosalind Gitlin, Barbara and Edward Klarman, and Shelley and Joel Tauber. And a special thank you to our community partner, the University of Detroit Mercy Women's and Gender Studies program. As Women's History Month comes to a close, we want to honor all of the brave women upon whose shoulders we stand so that women today can pursue their dreams, achieve their full potential, and use their voices to tell their stories. Tonight's program highlights some of those voices, the women whose often brave and traumatic wartime activities that then helped shape their lives after World War II. Their resolve continues to inspire us to effect positive change in our communities today. These narratives are brought into focus by tonight's speaker, Annette Joseph-Gabriel. Annette is the John Spencer Bassett Associate Professor of Romance Studies and Associate Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, which was awarded the Modern Language Association Prize for First Book and honorable mention for the Eugene Weber Award for Best Book in Modern French History. Also, she was previously an assistant professor of French at the University of Michigan. Annette's research has been featured by the Washington Post, HuffPost, France Culture, and other outlets. She is the recipient of the Carrie Chapman Catt Prize for Research on Women and Politics and serves as the senior editor of Pamphlicest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International. It's my honor to welcome Annette Joseph-Gabriel.
Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can someone give me a thumbs up or something in the chat? Let me know if you can hear me okay, see my screen, something. Okay, okay, perfect. All right. All right. So I'm gonna start my timer. I would like to thank Liz Pinctella for inviting me to share my work with you all today. I'm really grateful to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center staff who have worked really hard on the publicity and the logistics of this event. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined this webinar this evening. I'm very excited for our conversation today about Black women in World War II. I will be focusing primarily on Black women in France and the French colonies. So in my book, Reimagining Liberation, I talk about the anti-colonial efforts of 7 Black women. For all of them, World War II was a crucial turning point in their political activism because Black women from the French colonies of Africa and the Caribbean found themselves having to do battle on 2 fronts during the war. They were now up against fascism, but they had also been struggling against the oppression of French colonialism for most of their lives. So you'll be hearing me talk about their struggle on 2 fronts, really. What I want to do today is to give a brief overview of the actions of 4 of the 7 women. I won't have time to talk about all 7. I'm hoping I can get to 4. But to just kind of share with you what they did during the war and how those actions sparked their political activism after the war. But beyond showing that women did important and courageous things during World War II, I will also show how their wartime action influenced their refusal of French colonialism and their vision for equality and political representation in France. So the first person I want to talk about is Suzanne Césaire, who was born on the French Caribbean island of Martinique in 1915. She studied philosophy in France, where she met and married the Martinican philosopher and writer Aimé Césaire. In 1939, with war looming on the horizon, the Césaires decided to return to Martinique aboard a ship called the SS Bretagne. I'm going to ask you to keep the name of this vessel in mind, SS Bretagne, because it will return in a subsequent story. But for now, it is important to know that within a few short months of Suzanne Césail's return home to Martinique, World War II would drastically change the political landscape on the island of her birth. The Vichy regime brought significant political changes to Martinique. The pro-Nazi collaborationist government that ruled France from 1940 to 1943 appointed colonial officials who were sympathetic to the draconian laws of Philippe Pétain's National Revolution. So essentially, just a little bit of sort of background context, right? Martinique and Guadeloupe were what are known as vieilles colonies or old colonies, and they had had a long history of political engagement and representation in France, dating back to the 1848 abolition of slavery. During World War II, under Admiral Georges Robert, so Vichy's High Commissioner to the French Antilles, those already limited freedoms disappeared. So Robert revoked universal male suffrage, right? So in the vieille colonie, men could vote, revoked during World War II. Robert replaced Black mayors, so elected officials, with white Creole businessmen. And he also implemented new measures, increasing surveillance and curtailing movement. And so, people who've kind of left testimonies about that time period recall especially that any kind of dissension was met with arbitrary detention and deportation from the island. So this was the atmosphere of political repression that reigned in Martinique when Suzanne Césail co-founded the journal Tropique. Now, because the Vichy regime scrutinized publications on the island, Césail had to develop what we can describe as the skill of literary evasion, by which I mean that she published subversive essays that were camouflaged as ethnographic studies. So let's look at one example of this camouflage, right? What is the kind of dissident thinking that Césail is expressing in this publication at this very dangerous time? And how is she camouflaging it? So one example, in 1941, Césail published an essay in the first issue of Tropique titled Leo Frobenius and the Problem of Civilizations, which is really as academic as it sounds, right? In this essay, she proposed to synthesize for her readers the ideas about civilization that were put forward by the German ethnologist Leo Frobenius in his work. And so she begins her essay by saying, a fundamental problem is that of civilization. We live it, we celebrate its progress, or deplore its decadence. However, what is it in its essence? So on its surface, there's nothing particularly political or threatening, right, about this question. There's nothing threatening to a fascist regime about summarizing the writings of an ethnologist. Césail ends her essay with the following declaration. It is now vital to dare to know oneself, to dare to confess to oneself what one is, to dare to ask oneself what one wants to be. Here also, people are born, live, and die. Here also, the entire drama is played out. On the surface, this is beautiful writing, but it might not be readily apparent as a forceful statement of dissidence until you read it alongside the early radio broadcasts that were made by Vichy France's head of state, Philippe Pétain. So there was one radio broadcast in 1940 directed to the overseas colonies, and then again in November 19, 1942, right? So Pétain addresses this radio broadcast to overseas France, in which he declared, I remain your guide. You have only one duty, to obey. You have only one government, that which I have given the power to govern. You have only one fatherland, that which I embody, France. So when you put these side by side, right, we return to Césail's essay, we can see how what she's doing in this essay is really issuing a counter call for autonomous and therefore dissident thinking under a fascist regime, right? It is not for fascist France to declare or define who Martinicans are, right? She says it is for us to dare to know who we are. Eventually, however, the subversive nature of Tropique became clear to the Vichy regime, right? Despite these literary evasion skills. So in 1943, Vichy's chief of information services, Lieutenant de Vaisseau Bayle, banned the journal and wrote the following letter to its editors. Right, so he writes the editorial collective of Tropique, of which Suzanne Césaire is part. He says, "Dear Sir, when Madame Césaire requested from me the paper necessary for a new issue of Tropique, I immediately acquiesced, seeing no objection, on the contrary, to the publication of a literary or cultural review," right? So if you think about that essay on civilization, right, it appeared to be really a journal that was really publishing, literary and cultural things. I do have, on the contrary, very formal objections to a revolutionary, racial, and sectarian review. The manuscripts that have been submitted to me can leave no doubt as to these characteristics, right? So then Bayle continues the letter by accusing Césaire and her co-editors of being, quote, racist, sectarians, and poisoners of souls. Now, remember the kind of the regime of political oppression that I described for you, right? Under the fascist regime, people had been imprisoned and deported for much less than these accusations. And so Césaire's scathing response on behalf of the editorial collective was an act of courage. She wrote back to Bayle and she said the following: "Sir, we have received your indictment of Tropique." Now, anything you see here in quotes, she is quoting directly from the Vichy government's letter and then turning those quotes on their head, right? So she says, "Racists, sectarians, revolutionaries, ingrates and traitors to the country, poisoners of souls. None of these epithets really repulses us. Poisoners of souls like Racine, ingrates and traitors to our good country like Zola, revolutionaries like the Hugo of Châtiment, sectarians passionately like Rimbaud and Lautréamont. Racists, yes, of the racism of Toussaint Louverture, of Claude McKay and Langston Hughes against that of Drummond and Hitler. As to the rest of it, don't expect for us to plead our case, nor vain recriminations, nor discussion. We do not speak the same language." What a response. There is a lot that we can say about Césaire's response to Bayle. I want to pick out just two things. First is that you'll see here that she names both French and Afro-diasporic writers and political figures, right? Not in a hierarchy, but as a constellation of thinkers whose different strands of knowledge shape the composite vision of Tropique's anti-fascism. So Césaire is drawing on influences from the Haitian Revolution with Toussaint Louverture, right? The Harlem Renaissance with Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, right? In order to kind of build this vision of, this vision of liberation in challenging the letter that she has received from the fascist government. And the second thing I want to highlight is that devastating closing line. "We do not speak the same language" expresses Césaire's refusal to engage with the fascist government on its terms. So she takes the state's terms, racist, sectarians, revolutionaries, etc., and redefines them as the starting point of her challenge to fascism. When Suzanne Césaire stepped off the SS Bretagne onto Martinican soil in September 1939, she had no idea that the ocean liner's return voyage to France would be its last. Nor could she know that her compatriot and fellow writer Paulette Nardal would be aboard the vessel during its harrowing last days as one of the first casualties of World War II. So here you can see an image of the Nardal sisters. Paulette was one of 7 sisters, and you can see her pictured here. She was the oldest. She's standing with 2 of her younger sisters. But Paulette Nardal was a writer and a journalist who had been living for the last several years in France. She had returned home to Martinique to work on a tourist film at the request of the minister of the colonies, Georges Mandel. Fully expecting her stay on the island to be temporary, she had left her Paris apartment in the care of the building's concierge. 2 months later, she was still in Martinique working on the film project when World War II broke out. Determined to return to her home, life, and work in Paris, Nardal secured passage aboard a banana carrier and arrived at the dock at Fort-de-France an hour before the ship's scheduled departure, only to learn that the carrier had already left. Telegrams dispatched to Martinique had been warning of German submarine attacks, and so the captain had thought it prudent not to linger. Nardal must therefore have been relieved to find space on the next departing ship. It's a name we've heard before, the SS Bretagne, that had brought the Seychelles home to Martinique, and that was now making its return journey to France. On October 13, a month after her departure from France, and with the ocean liner one day away from the English coast, Nardal's relief turned to horror. The liner was torpedoed by the German submarine U-45. She would later recall the German guns hammering away at the section of the ship where the lifeboats reserved for women and children were stored. Nardal had to act quickly. 3 times she tried to grasp a knotted cord and attempt the daring maneuver of climbing down the side of the ship into one of the lifeboats. 3 times she failed. And then there was a loud explosion, and Nardal felt herself fall into the void and land knees first in a lifeboat. She lifted herself onto a bench and spent an agonizing 4 hours waiting for a rescue ship. Her injuries were so extensive that during the first days of her nearly year-long recuperation at City Hospital in Plymouth, as German Luftwaffe bombs rained down on the city, medical personnel were reluctant to send the telegram that Nardal had composed to her family in Martinique, letting them know that she was alive, because they were convinced that she would not survive. I will say that I wrote several years ago a very short blog post, just kind of like recounting Nardal's incredible story, and posted that on a blog online. And the most remarkable thing happened. A man who I have never heard from before and have never again heard from since emailed me and said that his grandmother was a nurse at City Hospital in Plymouth when Paulette Nardal was brought in as a patient. His grandmother's name was Beryl Harris, and he had been going through her old photographs, and he came across this, which is a photograph of Paulette Nardal in her hospital bed being visited by the mayor of Plymouth and his wife. And she autographed this photograph, for Nurse Beryl Harris. And you can kind of read, Paulette Nardal was bilingual. She taught English, so she could speak English. And she's kind of written at the bottom there, if you can sort of see at the bottom of the screen, she says, "To Nurse Harris, in remembrance of those dreary days when her delicate friendship and nursing brought me such relief. With love, Paulette, the City Hospital, 28th April 1940. But remember that the attack happened in September 1939. It's April, she's still in a hospital bed, unable to walk, right? So Paulette Nardal spends nearly a year in hospital, and there's this amazing and beautiful connection and friendship that happens in that moment. Nardal did eventually recover. She returned to Martinique with no possessions, no source of income, a terror of loud noises, and a permanent limp. She had to depend on her elderly father's meager income to survive, and supplemented it by giving English classes to Martinican dissidents who were preparing to leave for neighboring English islands, where they would continue to Europe to join the French resistance. Now, Nardal's wartime injuries very quickly put French citizenship to the test and showed the limits of those promises of citizenship, especially for Black people in the colonies, right? So what happened is that Nardal wrote to the governor of Martinique, a French colonial administrator, requesting disability benefits and compensation for her losses as a French citizen. It took several years. Letters and telegrams went back and forth between the colonial administrator, who later was Georges Parisot. Remember his name, it'll come back, right? So Georges Parisot was the governor. Letters went back and forth between his office in Fort-de-France and the colonial commission in Algiers. Nardal kept waiting for news. Will she be reimbursed? She has lost everything. The blow came in 1945 in a telegram from Algiers. Nardal was not eligible for compensation because there was no legislation that recognized civilian casualties in colonies that had not suffered direct damage. That was the exact quote in the letter, in the war. And so her claim to indemnity as a war victim had been denied. and with it, all the contributions that Martinique had made to the war effort. Essentially, what's happening here is that because Martinique is geographically distant from Europe, the idea that was being claimed here is that the island had not suffered direct damages in the war, and so Martinicans were not eligible for compensation. And this idea of direct damages erased the very real loss of lives of colonial conscripts. It erased the suffering of rationing and subjection to the double oppression of colonialism and fascism that Martinicans had in fact endured in wartime. Unlike Suzanne Césaire, who wrote a daring letter denouncing fascism, Paulette Nardal doesn't come across in this story as having done anything heroic. She's rather the victim of a German attack. So why include her in these stories? Her traumatic experience sharpened her resolve to advocate for full citizenship rights for Martinican women, right? So remember that she's fallen through the cracks. She's not eligible for disability benefits. She wants to make sure that Martinican women benefit from full citizenship rights after the war. So in 1944, Nardal founded an organization called the Rassemblement Féminin, or the Feminine Assembly. And she also served as editor of the Rassemblement Féminin's journal, La Femme dans la Cité, or Woman in the City, that was published monthly between 1945 and 1951. These were crucial years in the political history of Martinique because in 1946, Martinique changed status from colony to overseas department of France, right? So suddenly, Martinican women could vote. Martinican women had a crucial role to play, Paulette Nardal believed, as the new body of voters who could advocate for Martinique's interest in the French political arena. Better wages, education, healthcare, social security benefits. In the aftermath of a devastating and impoverishing world war, these were the battles to be waged for equality. And so Nardal's journal became a prominent publication in which women debated and advocated for these issues. I'll say really quickly, because this is what I find so amazing about Paulette Nardal, is that in a very short period of time, right, just about a year after she founded this journal, the French colonial administration was trying to gather information about Martinican women to kind of understand their political thinking, right? They were like, okay, there's a new voting bloc. What should we anticipate? They sent messages to all of the colonial administration officers. No one had information because no one was interested or studying Martinican women. One head of information service responded to Georges Parisot, right, whose name we've heard before, and said, I quote, "It seems to me that the only person able to provide information on this question is Mademoiselle Nardal, director of the journal La Femme dans la Cité." And so just 2 months after Parisot sent that letter denying her disability benefits, Nardal's name crossed his desk once more, this time as the leading voice in women's issues in Martinique. He denied her benefits, but she did not deny his request for information. She wrote an extensive report on the lives and challenges of women on the island in order to influence public policy and demand an improvement in their living conditions. We've been talking about two women who came from Martinique. I want us to take a larger view of the French-speaking world to see how women crossed borders and imagined transnational solidarity after World War II. And the person who allows us to connect South America, Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe is Eugénie Éboué-Tell. In 1946, Eugénie Éboué-Tell made history as the first Black woman to serve in the French National Assembly. But only 3 years earlier, she had been, first and foremost, a woman condemned to death and a mother unsure that she would ever see her children again. Eugénie Éboué-Tell was born in French Guiana on 23rd November 1891, and she's often known as the wife of Félix Éboué. You can see her in the middle of this photograph next to Félix, her husband, and her daughter Jeanette on the other end. Félix Éboué, of course, was the Guyanese governor of Chad, who was also the first French administrator to respond yes to Charles de Gaulle's rallying cry to form the Free French Forces, right? So when Charles de Gaulle sent his famous call from London, Félix Éboué is one of the first to say yes. But Eugénie Éboué-Tell was more than just the wife of a high-ranking colonial official. She also publicly supported Charles de Gaulle. And after the war, she became quite closely affiliated with him politically. I learned this only recently, last month, when I visited the Fondation Charles de Gaulle, which is, today kind of an archive and a museum, but, back in the day was housed Charles de Gaulle's office before he became head of state. Please ignore the blurry photograph of me, but I just wanted to show you what's behind me, which is first that the desk you see there was Charles de Gaulle's desk. There's a sheet of paper that's resting on a book, which was Charles de Gaulle's appointment book. And the curator opened it to several pages. And there you can see Charles de Gaulle would record who's coming to visit him and for what period of time. And Eugénie Éboué-Tell's name appears there at least twice as someone who had these one-on-one, conversations with Charles de Gaulle after the war. But during the war, she joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and served as a nurse at a military hospital in the French Congo between 1941 and 1944. She was also one of a handful of people in Félix Éboué's inner circle who knew about the clandestine organizing of African troops in the early days of the French resistance. And here you can see her ID card, as a former combatant and volunteer for the French resistance. Because of her efforts in the French resistance, the Vichy government in France condemned her to death in absentia. So if she had returned to France, she would have been killed. And they seized her home in France and all her belongings. Her children were all living in France at the time. So her youngest son, Charles, was training in Britain and Canada to join the Air Force. But Eugénie and Félix for a year had no news about their three older children. What they learned later was that essentially her two sons, Henri and Robert, had been held in a German prisoner of war camp from June 1940. After 18 months, a year and a half, Robert managed to escape the prisoner of war camp. Henri was later released with the help of the camp's French doctor, who basically falsified a set of x-rays that showed him to be ill with tuberculosis. Her daughter, Jeanette, who you saw in that earlier photograph when she was a child at the time, was expelled from school, right? All of this was in retaliation for the Éboués participating in the French resistance. But Jeanette managed to gain admission to a different school in occupied France. Eventually, the three children were smuggled out of Europe on British passports and were reunited with their parents in Central Africa. The press explained that the children had been held, quote, as virtual hostages in France since the turbulent months following the armistice of June 1940, the period when the whole French colonial empire hung in the balance, end quote. Eugénie's wartime service and her later political work earned her at least 26 medals of recognition in France, in Ivory Coast, and other countries after the war. After the war, she also ran for office and became, like I said earlier, the first Black woman elected to the Constituent National Assembly, which was the name at the time for the French Parliament. She represented Guadeloupe in the Parliament from 1945 to 1946 and worked alongside fellow parliamentarians like Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor to draft the constitution of the French Fourth Republic. So for the whole French Fourth Republic, Eugénie Éboué-Tell was part of drafting the Constitution of France. After that 1 year in the assembly, she was elected to the Senate, where she continued doing that same kind of work, advocating for laws that would provide equal rights for those in the French, African, and Caribbean colonies who had just become French citizens under that new constitution that she had helped to draft. She particularly advocated for healthcare and benefits for women and children. And in this work, she often collaborated with the only other Black woman in the Senate, a woman whose name was Jeanne Vialle. When World War II broke out, Suzanne Césaire wrote essays denouncing fascism. Paulette Nardal challenged the colonial policies that excluded Martinican war victims from disability benefits, and that made Martinican women second-class citizens. Eugénie Éboué-Tell worked behind the scenes to free her children from occupied France. What did Jeanne Vialle do? Jeanne Vialle, born in the French Congo and living in Paris, moved to Marseille and joined the French resistance during the war. She worked as a clandestine agent. She was essentially a spy for Jean Guémaling, who was head of information services for an organization called Combat. And Combat was one of the three major resistance movements in the south of France. In this role, or because of this role, Vialle was arrested in January 1943. And Vichy police interrogators discovered that as a spy, she essentially handled large amounts of sensitive information that she expertly categorized and coded in language that Vichy police could not decipher. So if you're able to kind of make out, the TypeScript, if you're able to make out the French here, this is a long list of all of the damning documents that were found in Jeanne Vialle's home when her home was raided by Vichy police at the time of her arrest. And so here she had, for example, bulletins and pamphlets by Combat, so the resistance movement. She had information about train departures and arrivals, right? Train schedules. She had correspondence and transcripts of speeches by Charles de Gaulle. She had names and identities of Vichy police who were undercover operatives. She had falsified IDs, right? She was working under several pseudonyms. And the reason we know all of these things is only from Jean Guémaling's testimony, right? Her boss who was arrested with her, and from the documents that were found in her home. Because during her interrogation, Vialle only said one sentence over and over and over. Je désire m'expliquer en présence d'un avocat. I wish to speak in the presence of a lawyer, right? She kept demanding that legal right. Vialle was interned for 4 months in the Brennes women's concentration camp and then transferred to the Beaumet women's prison in Marseille until December 1943. Now, stay with me because things get a little bit strange here. We have two separate and opposing accounts in the archives of what happened to her next. Some sources, including the French government itself, indicate that Vialle was released from prison because there wasn't enough evidence to hold her. Other sources state that she broke out of the French prison in Marseille, like escaped and disappeared. And other sources suggest that both of those things are true, right? So she broke out of prison, was snatched back up again, went to trial, and was released for lack of evidence. Until today, I still can't tell you which of these is actually true. I cannot tell you what happened to Jeanne Vialle after December 1943. What I find interesting is that the opacity surrounding this period in her life is there for good reason. Vialle's strategy of survival depended on escaping the detection of state surveillance, right? Remember her silence and her camouflage of using falsified ID, right? And constantly saying, I have nothing to say. I have no way to explain this. I simply want to speak in the presence of a lawyer, right? That silence and camouflage became her way of escaping fascist surveillance and detection. And that's why in the record today, we still don't know what happened to her. And so today, Jeanne Vialle's trial proceedings and her case file are the only records that I'm aware of a Black French woman in a concentration camp during World War II. And I always say this because I'm hoping that one day someone in the audience will give me more examples. But for now, Vialle's is the only person for whom I have records. And these records till today remain sealed. They're accessible only with special permission from the French government. So when I was doing this research, right, I was told I had to write to the French government to request that these documents be unsealed. And I had to, make a case for the academic merit of my research. And then I got this letter back, giving me permission and saying that I could only use these documents on condition that I don't tarnish the image and good name of France. I don't know if I've lived up to that promise, but Vialle's story, I think, is a remarkable one. So she disappears, right, from the historical record. And then she resurfaces in the archives after the war in Central Africa, where we learn that she had gone on a 9,000-kilometer tour to campaign for election to the French Senate as an independent candidate who had founded her own political party. And she won. right? So she became a senator in France. And in addition to her work in the French Senate, she also founded an organization called the Association des Femmes de l'Union Française, or the Association of Women in the French Union. Okay, I've thrown a lot of things at you. I want to pause here for a second, right? What I'm going to do is to play for you a recording of Jeanne Vialle speaking. I will say that in all the years that I've been doing research about these women, I have never heard any of their voices until last month when I was, in France, and journalists at Radio France Internationale surprised me by scouring all of French colonial radio archives, and they found two recordings, two short clips of Jeanne Vialle's voice. I had goosebumps just hearing her voice. I want to play that recording for you, right? And I want us to do an activity, a very short activity that I call a word fall, which is like a waterfall, but with words, right? So here's the activity. When you think about Jeanne Vialle, when you think about her remarkable story, and when you hear her voice, I want you to think of one word that comes to mind that describes the kind of woman you think she was. When you listen to her voice, you hear everything that she had been through. What is one word that you think best describes her, right? So I'll play the recording. I'll ask you to type in your one word in the chat, but don't hit enter, right? I'm going to do a countdown, 3, 2, 1. When I say enter, we all hit enter at the same time. All our words come tumbling down together, and we'll see whether we're all on the same page. When you hear Vialle's story and you hear this recording of her voice, what is one word that comes to mind for you to describe who she was? Okay, so I'm going to just pull up the recording here. And here we go. And if you cannot hear me, somebody please just unmute and let me know. Or if you cannot hear the recording.
Monsieur, sont assez simples puisque nous voulons concrétiser l'Union française. Toutes nos réunions ont pour but de faire rencontrer les jeunes d'outre-mer, en la personne des étudiants que nous hébergeons dans nos 2 hôtels, jeunes gens et jeunes filles d'outre-mer, avec nos amis de la métropole. Et je compte beaucoup sur ces liens d'amitié qui peuvent s'établir entre les habitants de la France et des territoires d'outre-mer pour concrétiser l'Union française. Et je dois dire que la soirée de samedi a été une véritable réussite sur ce plan. Elle a été une réussite sur le plan artistique, puisque nous avions presque trop d'artistes. Il ne faut jamais se plaindre que la mariée est trop belle, mais enfin, la partie artistique a retenu nos invités jusqu'à 4 heures du matin et sans lassitude. Et je dois dire que les sicots avec Sonar Sangor qui clôturaient cette partie artistique ont remporté un véritable triomphe.
Est-ce que tous les territoires de l'Union étaient présents à cette fête?
Oui, tous les territoires de l'Union étaient présents, puisque nous avions Yanagani qui représentait l'Indochine, Sonar Sangor dont je vous ai déjà parlé, l'Afrique noire, Shukun, les Antilles, et dans la salle, il y avait Antillais, Indochinois, Malgaches, et nous avions même des amis haïtiens.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the audio here, right? I'm going to say, everyone open the chat, even if you don't make out the French, right? Think about the tone of her voice, everything that you've learned about her. What is the personality that comes through? I want you to type your one word into the chat. When I say enter, we all hit enter, right? So for now, think about your word, type it in. I'm going to do a countdown. 3, 2, 1, enter. Oh, wow. This is incredible. Okay, I'm seeing optimistic. Yes. Capable, knowledgeable, refined, her accent is very polished, poised. Yes. Okay. Very educated and smart, determined. Absolutely. Lots of calm. I like that we're all on the same page about her. Calm, invincible, tenacious, passionate. These are all gutsy. Yes, with an exclamation point. I love these. Yes, yes, yes. Absolutely yes to all of these. Okay. So I'm gonna put my my slide back, but thank you all so much. I absolutely agree with all of you, right? Is that when I think about all that she went through, I don't know what I'm expecting, but I wasn't expecting this level of this kind of calm, determination, poise, And also what strikes me is how light and joyful she sounds, right? So what's happening here, right? Remember, she kind of giggles at some point, is that she's describing a cultural event that she organized that showcased dance and musical performances from different parts of the French-speaking world. And there's just joy and celebration here that also informed her political work after the war. And we can see the same idea, right? That she was focused on joy and celebration even as she was advocating for equality. And she expresses this in the founding principles of her journal, right? That accompanied the association that she founded, the Association of Women of the French Union. She says for the founding principles, the women who experienced the torture of prisons, the horror of concentration camps, the life of the hunted, and who for many years trembled in fear for their parents, their friends, their work colleagues, wanted to bring together all of the women of overseas France in the spirit of fraternity, to work towards the same goal, to allow all women to establish honorable and happy homes in a peaceful atmosphere. If you even just split this into two parts, look at the nature of the words at the beginning, right? Torture, horror, fear, trembled, hunted. And then the vision that she has at the end, right, is one of joy, happiness, honor, and fraternity. And this is really the kind of work that Vialle continued to pursue throughout the laws that she pushed for in the French Senate, where she advocated for equality, equal treatment, equal scholarships, right, for students from overseas France coming to the French metropole to study. The four women I have talked about here used the traumatic experiences of wartime as a starting point to imagine a better world for Black women in the French Empire. They did not just advocate for inclusion, for the crumbs of empire, but rather for a dismantling of the exclusionary idea about citizenship that would unmake and remake the empire into a more democratic union. What does this all mean for us today? I think that their visions for Black French citizenship on their terms, rather than on the state's discriminatory terms, have not yet come to pass. And Josephine Baker is an example of that. I know that I have like just 1 minute left, so I'm gonna tell you just really quickly two interesting things to note about Josephine Baker. So some of you probably know, right, that in 2021, France inducted Josephine Baker into the Pantheon, which made her essentially the first Black woman to receive this honor that is conferred only on a select few of France's national heroes, right? And the French, White House, the Élysée, says in their statement that Josephine Baker represents the spirit of France, right? La France éternelle des lumières universelles, eternal France of universal enlightenment, kind of like smushing all the French buzzwords together. And the reason she does this, highlighted in yellow, the second yellow highlight, is because she participated in the struggles that unite French citizens, the French resistance, and anti-racism. Right, so that's the picture of Josephine Baker that they use here proudly in her, in her uniform. And Josephine Baker certainly participated in the French resistance as a clandestine courier who smuggled documents in her fancy costumes and who listened in on Nazi officials' conversations during her performances. She absolutely deserves to be recognized by France. At the same time, the timing of this recognition is important because it came on the heels of protests against police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's murder that also rocked France. And so memorializing Josephine Baker in 2021 allowed France to tell a story that it had been telling for a long time, that France is a land of equality, and that the African-American performers and intellectuals who moved to Paris in search of refuge from Jim Crow in the interwar years are evidence that France had always lived up to its motto of liberty, equality, fraternity. As the French state narrative goes, Josephine Baker could only attain the rags to riches American dream in egalitarian France, and therefore can be reproduced or recovered as proof that unlike the United States, France is not historically a racist country. This sounds like a positive story, but there are two troubling elements, the things that remain unspoken in this story. First is that recognizing Josephine Baker, who was American, allows France to recognize a Black woman without having to acknowledge its own colonial history, without having to acknowledge that Josephine Baker's experience was not representative necessarily of other Black women from the French colonies. Navigating 1930s and 1940s France as an American woman was quite different from doing so as a woman from a French colony, such as Martinique or Mali. And the second and last sort of unspoken thing that I'll say here is that the thing that allowed Josephine Baker to become this polished figure you're seeing on your screen here is that in her early years in France, she had to play into French colonial fascination with Black women's bodies as objects of sexual desire in order to survive, in order to attain fame. And so ultimately, what happens here is that by recognizing Josephine Baker, but not the Black French women from the French colonies who were also part of the resistance, France can recognize a Black woman without also acknowledging the inconvenient memories of enslaved women on plantations in Martinique, or conscripted African soldiers who also participated in the French resistance and then were shot and killed on orders of the French colonial administration for demanding their pensions. If there is anything we learn from Suzanne Sévère, Paulette Nardal, Eugénie Éboué-Tell, and Jeanne Vialle, it is that how we tell stories about the past today matters. The stakes involved in those who we choose to remember and how we choose to remember them are not only about the past, they're also about our future. Thank you all so much for your attention. I'm so very much looking forward to our conversation.
Annette, thank you very much for that absolutely moving presentation. I think bringing these stories of these women and their lives to light is so important. We're going to now turn to our question and answer portion of the evening, which I know people are very excited about. So please remember that you can put your questions in the Q&A section in the Zoom. As we're letting people get their thoughts together and adding those in, I'd just like you to speak a little bit more. I'm so interested. You discuss the gaps in silence, you say willful or otherwise, when talking about archival visibility of women's stories and their contributions to history. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about some of the challenges of uncovering women's stories, why we often have to read between the lines to even understand and get these gendered experiences and perspectives.
Yeah, so I can give you two examples, right? Like one from Eugénie Éboué-Tell. So to find her story, like piece together her life story, I had to go to the Fondation Charles de Gaulle. That's where I did most of my research. There, you have so many archives, right? So many kind of categorized documents about Charles de Gaulle. And in there, in a subfolder, you have Félix Éboué's archive. And in a subfolder, you have Eugénie Éboué-Tell, right, who's underneath her husband's sort of folder. And so, right, like you already have to do just physically this kind of digging to get at women's stories. And then for someone like Suzanne Sévère, there is no subfolder at all, right? There's information about her husband because he was famous, but not much about her. It's really just tiny pieces of fragments. And so that's one of the challenges, is basically just even finding the documents that contain information about these women's lives and stories. There's very little to work with in some cases. And then in some cases, they chose to step away from the public eye, right? Because the price and the cost was high for women who were in the public eye. And so some of the other women that I write about never talk about their personal lives because they wanted to protect their families. And that's a decision too that we have to respect as researchers, right? Like not everything was meant for our eyes. And so we have to kind of respect that as well. So those are some of the challenges, right? It's just trying to navigate, the limited archival resources, and then learning when to respect those limits as well, right? When women wanted to protect themselves and their loved ones.
Thank you very much. I think that's fascinating. We have a question in the chat here. How did you choose these specific women, these heroines that you highlight in your book?
Yeah, so this is such a great question because essentially I started with only one woman. I had learned a lot about Aimé Césaire, right, who's a famous French Martinican philosopher, writer, poet, etc. And I learned that he had a wife, and I was like, what did she do, right? Where were the women? When I started to learn about Suzanne Césaire, I learned that she arrived in Martinique on the SS Bretagne. I learned that Paulette Nardal left on the SS Bretagne, right? So Suzanne Césaire led me to Paulette Nardal. Paulette Nardal had interviews in Paris with an African woman, Eslanda Robeson, who we might know as the wife of Paul Robeson, right? Who then interviewed Jeanne Vialle in Central Africa. So once you follow one person's trail, she takes you to all, right? Each person takes you to the next person, because ultimately these women worked in a network, right? They believed a lot in transnational solidarity, that this was not work that they could do in isolation, because fascism and colonialism were not things that happen in isolation, right? A global problem cannot have a national solution. And so they were constantly crossing borders in order to figure out, who can I work in relation with? And so that's how I ended up choosing the women. There were so many more, right, who ended up kind of falling out of this project. Because at some point, right, my editor was like, you need to finish the book, like only so many pages. But I think there's so many more books to write, right? So many other women, who had similar stories, more radical stories, more or less tragic stories. I think there's so many more stories to tell.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the chat that's talking specifically about how fascinating it is to learn about the French colonies during this period. And they want to know, are there any other German colonies that you would suggest people to study? Are there any other women that you wanted to highlight, sort of mentioning before, of the ones that got edited out of the book that you wish you had more space and time for?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I would recommend, for example, Tiffany Florville, who's a historian at the University of New Mexico, has a book titled Mobilizing Black Germany, right? So like this story that I'm telling about Black France, there's a Black German version of it. There's a Black Italian version of it, right? There's a Black British version of it, right? Like there's a Black American version of it. Like Black women all around the world, we're actively involved. And I think these stories need to come more to light. There's a book also titled To Exist is to Resist, which is a history, of Black women's activism, in Europe in the 20th century. But yeah, so those are maybe two starting points. I will say to also, just look at what's happening, in Britain at the time as well. Because women were involved. Women like Una Marson, for example, at the time. Women like Claudia Jones, who was going to write, a little bit after, but is thinking also about how class. We've talked a lot about race and gender, but how class, right, for working class people was also a factor in all of these struggles. So yeah, I could just go on, but maybe I'll put a couple of things in the chat for a running bibliography of places to start to look. But to exist and is to resist. It's a good starting point for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have another question asking, did any of these women ever emigrate to the United States at any point?
Ooh. So emigrate, no, but travel and spend time here, yes. So especially Eugénie Éboué-Tell and Jeanne Vialle. I can't remember which of them, but one of them, I think it was Éboué-Tell, did a ridiculous, it was something like 40 trips to the US during her time in the French Senate, right? They came back and forth a lot. And so some of the archives that I used to learn more about them were the NAACP archives here, right? Because there were a lot of African-American journalists who were really interested. They were like, look at these examples, right? Like, look at what Black women are doing in France. Do we have, can we make connections here? And so, old newspapers that you'll find still online today, like the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, right? Like a lot of Black newspapers have a lot of coverage about these women because they were constantly in conversation. But they didn't emigrate and move and stay here, no.
Thank you. You talk a lot about in your book about the loss and trauma, of course, that these women, many of them experienced during World War II. And many historians have argued before that you can sort of look at women on the margins of society and argue that this is, what gives them a predisposition towards activism, towards helping people. Is that something that you would also believe to be true, or perhaps have a different take on women and these sort of outer roles actually making a very large impact in history?
Yes, absolutely, right? Because if we think about, the theory of intersectionality today, right, which is that, like Black women, for example, sit at the intersection of multiple forms of oppression as Black and as women, right? Not additive or overlapping, but that they're really intersecting. These women were expressing and living that reality, right? Like several decades before it became part of our theoretical language. A lot of them describe, when you read, like their political writings, they talk about how it is the fact of these multiple exclusions that they suffered. Because think about these women in Martinique, for example, right? Black men in Martinique could vote, right? Like up until from 1848 up until, before the war began, up until the war began, and those rights were taken away. But women could not vote, right? Women in the colonies could not vote. I mean, French women couldn't vote either, actually, white French women until 1944, right? But like to live in a society where like that stark gender divide is there in terms of political enfranchisement, right? So you're feeling that as a woman, and then you're also feeling, the racism coming from the colonial government, that both women and men are suffering. Like it put women in this really unique position where they could see really clearly the multiple structures that had to be dismantled, which was not always the case for example, male activists who were not necessarily attuned to some of the things with regards to gender. So the main battleground, for example, when Martinique became an overseas department, was over social security benefits. France said, sure, you can become citizens, you can vote in elections, but you cannot have universal healthcare and social security benefits because Martinican women have too many children, right? That's both the racism and the sexism talking. And it was up to Martinican women to advocate for that. Once they got it, though, it was extended to everyone, right? Both men and women benefit from that, right? And so being at that unique intersection really made them attuned to the multiple things that had to be dismantled in order to make equality a reality for everyone.
That's fascinating. I think learning about the intersections of these women's lives brings such a richness to their stories, and why it's so important to learn about them on so many different levels. So I'm looking at all these comments in the chats of people saying they want so much more. They want book lists. They think that you're such a dynamic speaker. So thank you, Annette, for such a fascinating discussion. If you would like to purchase a copy of Annette's book, Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transform Citizenship in the French Empire. We've posted the link in the chat a few times, but we'll post it again. As we conclude tonight's Zoom event, I want to invite and encourage all of you to visit the Zuckelman Holocaust Center right here in Farmington Hills, Michigan. Our brand new permanent exhibition opened in January, and we are very intentional about including women's stories from the Holocaust within our exhibit. Women experienced the Holocaust differently because they were women. And I think you'll find so many connections between the stories that Annette was talking about tonight. And we highlight their stories in our exhibit, not because it has anything to do with identity politics, but because it is correcting the historical record. It's accurate, it's complete. And at the HC, we're very much committed to bringing and honoring the legacy of these women's stories during the Holocaust right here into our museum. So thank you, Annette. Thank you, everyone, again, for joining us tonight. Please visit our website to stay in touch for other programming, and we hope you all have a very good night.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your engagement. I know I couldn't get to all of the questions, but I really appreciate your being here, for playing along with the word fall. And thank you so much to the Zuckelman Center staff for making this event happen. Thank you.